Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone did well on the post-lunch food quiz. Thanks, Nick, for preparing that. So welcome to the first afternoon session, which is Encouraging Diversity and Equalities, Time to Talk. So I'll introduce you to Viv Woodcott-Downey in a moment, who's going to introduce the session. And then we'll be going into some small group discussions after that, to then come back as a group and look at what we've been discussing. So during whilst Viv is talking, it'd be great if you could stay muted and have your cameras off. It just helps with some of the technology to make sure everything runs smoothly. My name's Anthony Statham. I'm the head of operation at Active Sussex, and I'll be the host for the session. So we'll be like I said, we'll be going with Viv, small group discussions, then coming back at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Viv Woodcott-Downey, who's a trustee at Active Sussex. Viv, over to you.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you for that introduction. Hello, everybody. But I can't see anybody, of course. All I can see is names on little squares in front of me. So I assume you're all still there and you nipped out to the loo. Anyway, hello everyone. I'm pleased to be able to introduce this workshop. I want to put it out there in front of you all that I am no expert in diversity and inclusion, but I am a real believer in the need for equality and inclusion in sport and physical activity. So with that, what I want to try and do over the next 15 minutes is to share some of my own thinking on recent events and how that impacts on our work, really. And how it helps us to think about diversity and inclusion. And I thought I'd start off by really just connecting back to this morning to Mike from Sport England. He talked about the indefensible inequalities in sport and in sport and physical activities. He was really making that very strong point that, you know, this has gone on long enough and it needs to be resolved, really. We can no longer defend it. So where I'd like to start is thinking about mission. All organisations in our sector have a mission. That might be to get more girls playing netball. It might be to maximise income from that really expensive gym that we've just installed. It might be to improve the county's health and wellbeing. My own organisation, the Federation of Gay Games, has the mission of eliminating discrimination against LGBT people all around the world, whilst we organise the quadrennial event that's known as the Gay Games. So the mission statements in all our organisations are many and varied. I don't know if you know off the top of your head what your organisation's mission statement is and whether it relates to diversity and inclusion. But I believe that we all, us at this conference, all share one mission. And that mission is to make the appeal of sport and the positive impact of healthy lifestyles as broad and as inclusive as possible. Our county's health and wellbeing depends in part on increased levels of activity being adopted and sustained everywhere, not just with some people or in some places. It needs to be everywhere with all people. This is such an important mission, especially now. Mike, again, this morning showed us how COVID has so visibly impacted on health inequalities and how it brought them really visible to the fore. So it is a really, really important mission. And with this mission, with any mission, but with this mission comes responsibility. The responsibility to ensure that no group or individuals are excluded from what we're trying to do. This is really important. It's equally important whether it's on the track, in the gym, on the field, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's on the board as a trustee, on the coaching bench, in the office, wherever we are, wherever we're making a difference, it's that responsibility sits with us. Again, referring back to this morning, listening to the discussion this morning, I think amongst us all that we agree that there are a number of important values in sport. The values of equality, of friendship. A lot of people talked about overcoming isolation in the workshop that I was in this morning. Inspiration, being inspired by this girl can or other different things that we see. I particularly love that let's kick out the stereotypes. I thought that was a brilliant image. Motivation, diversity, community, these values are really, really forefront, I think, of most of our minds as we're doing our work. And I think it's worth remembering that these values help us to focus on the power of sport and physical activity to change lives. And if we focus on this power to change lives, why on earth would we want to leave out any groups or individuals? It says here, breathe, because I talk too fast, so telling myself to take a breath. In its early years, work around inclusion in sport really aimed to avoid exclusion, making sure that we didn't leave people out, rather, we didn't do things that excluded people. But now I think we see inclusion as so much more than that. Inclusion in sport is about emphasising including all members of society, regardless of whether it's to do with poverty, geographic isolation, disability, social issues, religious issues, ethnic backgrounds, gender or gender expression. I thought maybe a little example might, if I just tell you this, a little example from my own life about inclusion, exclusion, just might illustrate it a bit. A friend of mine joined a running club when he first moved to Brighton. He's a really keen and committed long distance runner. And within 5 minutes of setting out on the first run, on the first day he was with this club, he was asked if he had found himself a girlfriend yet. By the end of the run, he was judged as standoffish. My friend is deaf. He's a deaf gay man who lip reads. Needless to say, he left that club and he went on to set up his own LGBTQ+ running group, which actually is still going on today and still really strong. So from that little example, I think inclusion in sport can be defined as a sense of belonging, a sense of feeling respected, of being valued for who you are, feeling a level of supportive energy and of commitment from others around you. So let me just ask you a question. Just take a moment to reflect. What's your personal experience of inclusion? And now think about, what's the experience of inclusion for other, more diverse people? Is it the same as yours? It's a question I think that is worth pondering on. I was at one of these webinar-y things, and we've all got so good at them, haven't we, during the last few months. And when it was about diversity, and somebody actually asked in the group, so what is diversity and inclusion? And the reply that came from the D&I officer who was running it really surprised me, because she said, diversity is saying everyone can come to my party, but inclusion is being given an invitation and being invited onto the dance floor when you get there. I thought it was an interesting way of thinking about the difference between diversity and inclusion. And so if we think of that, how do we make sure that everyone is invited to the party? How do we invite them to get down on the dance floor and boogie with us? Yeah, boogie nights. From what I've seen and heard during my time as a trustee of Active Sussex, I think that we're all agreed that diversity and inclusion is a good thing. And that's in capital letters in my thing here. If diversity and inclusion are so good, like apple pie and motherhood, I guess, why haven't we already got it? Why hasn't it happened? I would say because it doesn't just happen by itself. It needs commitment. It needs to be purposefully driven by all the stakeholders in our world of sport and activity. I think we know that it's not sufficient just to hire diverse managers and coaches, for instance, or to include a couple of pictures of women or people of colour on our websites. Organisations must focus on active inclusion strategies and make sure that everyone can contribute or benefit equally. In our sports clubs, in our organisations, we want equality and diversity, but it must be supported by creating inclusive organisational cultures. This has to be intentional. It just doesn't happen by accident. It needs committed and purposeful leadership. So I guess another really big question for us is, how can we, each one of us, provide that leadership in our club or in our service or in our organisation? It's a big question, but if we truly believe that our mission changes lives, then we must find a way. I think one important part of the way forward is to open our minds to learning how we can do things differently, how we can do things better. We're all learning all the time. We can learn from each other, we can learn from our mistakes, pretty painful sometimes, but we can learn from our mistakes. We can learn from our experiences, and we can learn from the experiences of other people. I think learning is an important part of leadership, but it's a funny old thing. When I was 16, a couple of years ago, my mum paid for driving lessons for my 17th birthday. I was beyond excited. I was sure it was going to be easy. After all, my dad could drive, so surely I'd be able to do it. I don't know how many of you know about the learning cycle and the first stages of that learning cycle, but that first stage is called unconscious incompetence. It's a state where we don't know what we don't know. If we've never thought about diversity and inclusion before, we have no idea what it is or how to tackle it. So back to my driving lessons. When I got in the car on that first driving lesson on my 17th birthday, I was astounded. I had to wind this at the same time as looking in that, whilst I was pushing that up and pressing that down. And all the time I had my arms sticking out of the window. It just felt undoable. I'd moved into a new part of the learning cycle, the stage of conscious incompetence. I suddenly knew what I didn't know. I realised I didn't know how to do it. I think if we think about the Black Lives Matter protests, we suddenly found ourselves confronted with white privilege, with microaggressions, with the horror that this is the experience of so many people's lives. Many of us just became aware that we were just not equipped to be able to change this effectively. It's an uncomfortable place to be consciously incompetent, to know we don't know what to do. For many people, this is likely to stop us wanting to talk about it, for fear of getting it wrong, or for fear of offending, or for fear of showing ourselves up. Anyway, back to my driving lessons. A few lessons later, although I did pass my test when I was 35, as long as I thought about what I was doing and I stayed focused, I could drive the car. I was consciously competent, and I got a certificate to prove it. I got my driving license. So there I was driving along, consciously looking in the mirror maneuver signal, and all of those things that we were supposed to do. I think it's mirror signal maneuver, isn't it? Anyway, now I can get into the car and I drive from Brighton to Manchester without even noticing Birmingham on the way. This is called the stage of unconscious competence. I've internalised how to do it. I can do it without thinking. It's just a natural way, a natural part of how I do things now. The problem with unconscious competence is, taking the driving example, is when a lorry swerves in front of me on the M6. That's when I suddenly have to go instantly back into that state of conscious competence. I have to think about what I'm doing to keep control of the car. I have to stay focused on driving safely whilst I'm getting the control of my heart rate and my nerves. George Floyd's death and the resulting Black Lives Matter protests took many of us back to that stage of conscious competence. It's not that we didn't already have diversity policies and programs and all sorts of activities going on, but George Floyd's death and the resulting cultural shift that we've seen has forced us to think consciously about what we're doing, to bring our focus back to inclusion in our organisations, in our sports clubs, in our work, to challenge the complacency in many of our organisations about diversity and inclusion. It's made us want to act purposefully. It's reminded us of the values of sport. They help us to change lives. We're going to be going into breakout groups soon, and these group sessions have been designed to give us all an opportunity to consider the issues of diversity and inclusion and to have an open and honest conversation as a starting point for change. So remembering the power of sport changes lives, and we want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to do that. As we get ready to go into our breakout groups, Let's think about creating a culture of inclusion in talking about D&I. Let's agree that this is a learning session, that we're all in different places on that competence cycle. Let's be honest, but gentle with each other while we bravely explore how we can continue to make our sports clubs, our organisations, our county ever more diverse and inclusive. Enjoy the conversation, and we'll all get back together again in about 30 minutes. Thank you, Anthony.
Great. Thanks so much, Viv, and I'm sure we're all giving a virtual round of applause after that start. So thank you very much. So we're now going to go into our group discussions. So shortly you will receive a notification. So click on that. That'll go into groups. We're going to have 4 groups. So there'll be around 10 or 10 or 11 people in a group. Yeah, enjoy the conversations, be honest and open, and I look forward to seeing you back here in around 30 minutes time. So Viv, are you good to go? You're on mute, Viv.
There we go. I'm on mute. Isn't that one of the new expressions that we've all learned? You're on mute. You're on mute. I think that was probably the most said expression throughout this last 4 months. Anyway, thank you. So let's start off, Anthony. Let's start off with you. What was? Give us 3 or 4 kind of flavours from what came up in your discussions.
Yeah, we actually had it was really honest conversation. I think one of the key points that came out of it was pretty much all the group actually had personal stories that they wanted to share, and I think that's really important when looking at like diversity and inequalities. Is to actually, it's probably affected most people in some way, and actually then having that conscious, unconscious that awareness of actually like that somebody else has got a story as well. And I think that was something I thought was quite powerful that came through. We looked at some of the things that came through actually related to yourself, Viv, was actually that opportunity to, with the learning analogy. I can't get my words out. And actually that was a really useful way to start to look at it and potentially start to think about it when you go back into your own organisations. And to actually start to go, right, actually, we probably do need to have a discussion around that. And that was something that came through as, you know, something that was important. One of the other things that came through, I know these are summaries, but just you can't assume things.
Yeah.
So you can't assume or what's in front of you or what's happening around you. So it is sometimes taking that step back and actually questioning it. And there was a really good reflection of someone that was really open in our group that kind of did question themselves around their thought process. And I thought that's kind of was for the session. I thought that's a really good starting point, is to actually do go back and you question yourself, because that's the learning cycle that we're going on. So we kind of, in terms of the questions that we were going to look at, we kind of covered them in many ways, but through our open discussion. So yeah, thanks to my group, and sorry, Joy, when you got cut off at the end.
I'm sorry to hear that, Joy. Oh, thanks, Anthony. So let's move to Gemma. Where are you, Gemma? I can't see you. Wave at me so I can see you. Oh, there you are. Yeah.
Yeah, again, we had some really fantastic conversations and a few personal examples, and the ability to, share and ask questions and really share that kind of knowledge. I think some of the kind of key things, similar to what Anthony was saying about, not making assumptions. But I think also, one of the kind of key areas in summarising, what we were talking about was about, if we're going to help with that commitment to make a change, is, we need to build trust and work with our communities, really understand, what the needs are, and appreciate that, we are going to be learning and we're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. You learn by your mistakes, and I think you stated that obviously in your in your dialogue. So we talked about how can we understand those communities, and a few colleagues said they've actually got quite a range of data and insight to really show where the need is for those individuals. So I think it's, you know, making sure that we as a network are aware that there is information out there, it's just finding it. And on from that conversation was, okay, well, how do we go about doing that? How do we connect with the right people in the right organisations that can advocate for us and can provide us with, you know, those links into those communities? And that was something that, you know, the partners that were on our group said, is that something that Active Sussex can, you know, obviously support, and have some sort of networking list that shows, you know, who are the right people to talk to. So yeah, I think, unless Henry, he was in my group as well, so unless Henry had anything else he wanted to add. No,
not hearing anything from
no.
Henry.
But yeah, no, so that was kind of, yes, summary of our group.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks ever so much, Gemma. Is Sadie there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Sadie. So what was the summary from your group?
So I think, firstly, thanks to you for that really great analogy of the driving and the bias and the unconscious conscious. I think that hit home with quite a few people. We looked at some of the barriers and potential solutions. So I just gave people time and space to speak. And actually, you know, a couple of colleagues probably would have wanted a little bit longer to actually reflect on what was being shared. But thank you to everyone in my group for sharing some of those personal experiences. We talked about some of the barriers being not seeing people like me, you know, females, you know, people of colour, you know, LGBT in leadership roles, or making them feel welcome at a club. And some of the things where people have talked about solutions is actually, although COVID's been a bit of a pain, they've been able to go out and meet some communities through some of the partnerships that they've done, like food partnerships. You're going into communities and you've got direct contact with people and you're starting to understand some of their issues. And so we talked about the partnership approach. We talked about people like me and making sure the workforce that is there is reflective of the community. And, you know, we had a couple of experiences where people didn't feel comfortable at their club and they had to call it out. And, you know, although change will take a while, they're glad they raised it. You know, because they could see, you know, following George Floyd, that it was an issue for some people. We also talked about some of the good things in terms of using positive images of promotion. So you do see people like yourself taking part and you feel that a club will be inclusive if you go. So that was recognised as quite important. You know, but do start with lived experiences, do come across as authentic. And we talked about, you know, things that are community-led and person-centred. If we're getting to the heart of the community and starting to understand them, then we'll be putting in place provisions and activities that they're really going to feel are worthwhile and welcoming to them. And also, one of our colleagues talked about personal connection, being able to have, you know, face-to-face interaction and be trusted. So I think Gemma touched on that, is that, you know, is the person authentic? Are they trustworthy? Are they really providing an inclusive base? And finally, we had the use of user forums. So where a colleague recognised that actually they promoted themselves as inclusive, they were still predominantly just getting one race and colour coming through the doors. So they formed a forum. You know, it has been difficult to find or to go where people like others are, but it's a starting point. And so I think our discussion probably could have had another half an hour quite easily to allow people just to speak and reflect and then have the courage to speak again. So thanks for starting the conversation, Viv. It was appreciated.
Oh, that's okay. I'm around if you need somebody to help you have the continue the conversation.
There you go.
But anyway, let's hear from Andy first, from the last group. Andy, what was the sort of the headlines from your group?
Yeah, it was again, a really thought-provoking session, and I think people probably need more time to really pull together ideas, and hopefully we'll be on this too. But we talked firstly about some of the experiences that people have had, such as setting up clubs so they're free to everyone, trying to understand different barriers that people have, looking at different ways of connecting. Ability doesn't matter. So some of the key kind of bits that we're trying to make sure we have running through as themes in our clubs. In terms of leadership, that was a really interesting discussion actually, looking at training leaders that we want and need to be leaders, and looking at what that leadership training should be and how we encourage more of that kind of style of leadership training so we have a more diverse leadership team. And extending from that, really, and Adrian made a very good point in our group, that everyone plays a part in tackling inequalities. Everyone plays a part, and everyone needs to have a voice. It can't just be one person that we're relying on, or one or two people that we're relying on. So that was a really good discussion we had around that. Making sure that we're giving people voices, giving people the chance to have voices, to try and make sure that we understand what they're saying, listen, helping co-design, make sure we can be as insightful as possible in the offers that we have out there. Again, really important. And don't be afraid to reach out for different services in different ways as well, away from physical activity. It was Kay in our group who talked about how we've looked at primary care trusts and examples of that they have to try and reach out to different people. So yeah, lots of discussion, lots of really interesting topics we went through, and I think they're bits that we can expand on going forwards too.
Great, thanks, Andy. So Anthony, I'll hand back to you to direct people where to go. But just before I do, can I just say thank you so much, everybody, for taking part in this. I was really nervous about doing it because I'm not a D&I person, but it clearly, I said enough to make people want to continue to have a conversation, and I'm just delighted that you enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Anthony.
Yeah, no, thank you, Viv. I think there's certainly, the way you set up the session, learning that's going to go on much deeper and past today. So you've certainly planted some seeds there for people to go away with. So yeah, again, once again, a huge virtual round of applause. You might not be able to hear us, but it's certainly very much appreciated. If I can see a few people coming on to give you a clap. So yeah, thank you, Viv. So what we'll do after the session is we'll send around, obviously, some information. We have got on the Active Sussex website a new webpage that's gone up today relating to disability and inclusion, to include that kind of wider resources and information that will be of use. So we'll circulate that afterwards. But otherwise, thank you for joining the session. I hope you found it a worthwhile discussion as a starting point for continual change, and look forward to seeing and speaking to you in person, hopefully sometime after the next 6 months. Thank you. All right.
See you, Anthony. See you, everybody.
Cheers.
Thank
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.